Hello everyone, welcome to the Boring History channel. Make sure you're subscribed so our daily history reaches you without missing a single story. Tonight we're stepping inside the seemingly perfect homes of 1950s America to discover what women really did from the moment they woke until the house finally went quiet. Behind the spotless kitchens and smiling advertisements was a daily life far busier and more surprising than nostalgia remembers. So get comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy and drift into another time. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. Imagine waking up in an American home sometime in the middle of the 1950s. When the morning light came through patterned curtains, the kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall, and the day often began long before the rest of the household was fully awake. For millions of women, especially married women with children, daily life was far more complicated than the polished advertisements of the era suggested. Magazine pages showed cheerful wives standing beside sparkling refrigerators, wearing spotless dresses and perfect smiles, as though keeping a home required little more than pressing a few buttons and waiting for a husband to return from work. Television programs reinforced a similar image: neat houses, well-behaved children, dinner arriving precisely on time, and mothers who rarely seemed tired. Real life was usually less effortless. A woman's routine depended greatly on her income, race, region, family size, whether she lived in a city, suburb, or rural community, and whether she worked outside the home. Yet, for many homemakers, the household itself was effectively a full-time workplace, and much of the labour happened quietly, repeatedly, and without a formal paycheck. The day might begin around 6 or 7 in the morning, sometimes earlier if a husband had a long commute or children needed to be prepared for school. There was no reaching for a smartphone or checking messages before getting out of bed. The first sounds might be an alarm clock, a radio announcer giving the weather, water running through pipes, or footsteps crossing a cold floor. Breakfast had to be prepared. Coffee might be started, bread toasted, eggs fried, oatmeal cooked, or cereal poured for children. In some homes, bacon, pancakes, biscuits, or other larger breakfasts were common, particularly on weekends, though everyday meals varied enormously according to household budget and local customs. While breakfast cooked, a mother might pack school lunches in paper bags or lunch boxes, find a missing shoe, remind a child to brush their teeth, iron something that had been forgotten the previous evening, and listen to her husband discussing the day's plans. The popular image of the 1950s housewife often shows her elegantly serving breakfast while everyone smiles around the table. But mornings with several children could be just as rushed and chaotic as they are today. Someone spilled milk. Someone refused breakfast. Someone could not find homework. Someone was suddenly sick. The woman managing the household was often expected to solve each small emergency while keeping the larger schedule moving. Once her husband left for work and the older children departed for school, the house did not necessarily become peaceful. Younger children might remain at home, and there was still an extraordinary amount of repetitive work waiting. Beds were made, bedroom windows opened for fresh air, clothes collected, towels hung properly, dishes washed, kitchen counters wiped, floors swept, and rooms straightened. Although household appliances were becoming increasingly common, ownership was far from universal, and even modern appliances did not eliminate domestic labor. Washing machines made laundry easier than earlier methods, but clothing still needed sorting, washing, rinsing, drying, folding, ironing, repairing, and returning to drawers and closets. Automatic dryers were spreading, but many families continued hanging laundry outdoors on clotheslines. On a clear morning, backyards could fill with sheets, shirts, dresses, socks, towels, and children's clothing moving gently in the wind. Hanging laundry was physical work. Wet fabric was heavy. Baskets had to be carried, individual pieces pinned to the line, and everything later collected before rain arrived or evening dampness settled in. Then came ironing. This could consume hours each week. Many garments were made from fabrics that wrinkled easily, and social expectations surrounding appearance could be demanding. Men's work shirts, children's school clothes, dresses, table linens and pillowcases might all pass beneath a hot iron. Some women sprinkled dry clothes with water and rolled them before ironing, so the moisture would soften the wrinkles. The ironing board could stand in the kitchen or living room while the radio played nearby, turning a monotonous task into an opportunity to follow music, serialized dramas, household programs or news. Radio remained an important companion, even as television expanded rapidly. A woman working alone inside the house could hear voices from distant studios filling otherwise quiet rooms. Cleaning was another constant responsibility. Vacuum cleaners were available in many homes, but they still had to be pushed from room to room. Rugs might need beating or shaking. Furniture was dusted, bathrooms scrubbed, kitchen surfaces cleaned, ashtrays emptied in households where smoking was common, and floors washed or polished. Maintaining the appearance of the home carried social meaning. A tidy house was often treated not simply as a pleasant environment, but as evidence that a woman was competent, respectable, and devoted to her family. Unexpected visitors could create anxiety because neighbours, relatives, salespeople, clergy members or friends might appear at the door with little warning. Hospitality mattered, and offering coffee, tea, cake, cookies, or another small refreshment was part of the social ritual in many communities. This pressure helps explain why housekeeping advice occupied so much space in women's magazines. Articles promised faster cleaning routines, better storage methods, easier recipes, and clever ways to make a home look fashionable without spending too much money. The post-war consumer economy was expanding, and manufacturers eagerly presented new appliances and household products as pathways to a happier life. Refrigerators became larger and more colourful. Electric mixers promised easier baking, vacuum cleaners grew more powerful, and supermarkets offered increasing numbers of packaged and frozen foods. Yet each convenience came wrapped in another expectation. If technology supposedly made housework easier, perhaps the home should now be cleaner, meals more elaborate, and family life more perfectly organized. Instead of eliminating work, convenience could sometimes raise the standard of what people believed a good homemaker ought to accomplish. Grocery shopping itself was an important part of the weekly routine. The modern supermarket was becoming a defining feature of American life, especially in expanding suburbs. A woman might write a shopping list after examining the pantry and refrigerator, clip coupons from newspapers, calculate how much the family could afford, and plan meals several days ahead. Food budgets mattered. The prosperous image associated with the 1950s did not describe every household, and many families watched expenses carefully. At the store, she might push a metal cart through aisles filled with canned vegetables, boxed cereals, gelatin desserts, cake mixes, cleaning powders, frozen foods, and brightly packaged products competing for attention. Marketing increasingly targeted women because advertisers assumed they made many household purchasing decisions. Grocery shopping therefore became an arena where corporations tried to define what modern domestic life should look like. A new detergent promised whiter clothes. A packaged dinner promised more time with the family. A particular coffee suggested sophistication. A refrigerator represented progress itself. Returning home meant carrying the groceries inside, putting everything away, and beginning another round of food preparation. Lunch could be simple if a woman was alone: leftovers, soup, a sandwich, or something eaten quickly between chores. If young children were home, childcare was woven into nearly every other task. A mother might wash dishes while watching a toddler, fold laundry, while answering endless questions, or interrupt cleaning because someone had fallen, started crying, or needed help. Disposable diapers existed, but were not yet the universal convenience they later became. So families with babies often dealt with cloth diapers that required washing and drying. Child rearing advice was also changing. Popular experts offered guidance on feeding schedules, discipline, sleep, manners, schooling, and emotional development. And mothers could feel enormous pressure to raise children correctly. The responsibility for children's behavior was frequently placed disproportionately on them. If a child misbehaved in public, performed poorly at school, or appeared improperly dressed, people might quietly judge the mother. Afternoon hours were often filled with errands and community obligations. A woman might visit the bank, post office, butcher, pharmacy, department store, or beauty salon. In suburban areas where families owned a second car, she might drive. In households with only one automobile, the husband often took it to work, leaving her dependent on walking, buses, neighbours, or careful scheduling. Contrary to the stereotype that women remained isolated inside their homes, many maintained active social networks. They visited neighbours, participated in church groups, volunteered at schools, joined civic organisations, attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with charities, belonged to women's clubs, played bridge, exchanged recipes, and organised community events. These networks provided companionship and practical support, especially when relatives lived far away. A neighbour might watch children during an emergency, lend an ingredient, share news, or simply provide another adult to talk to during a long day. Yet neighbourhood life could also bring comparison. Who had the newest television? Whose garden looked best? Whose children behaved properly? Who wore fashionable clothing? Social expectations could be subtle but powerful. And when the house finally became quiet at night, there was often another side of a 1950s woman's life that no advertisement could easily capture. It was the small amount of time that belonged entirely to her. Perhaps everyone else had gone to bed. The kitchen had been cleaned, tomorrow's lunches were prepared, and the radio was playing softly from another room. She might sit with a magazine, finish a few pages of a novel, write a letter to a sister living in another state, repair a torn shirt, or simply enjoy the unusual luxury of doing nothing for a few minutes. These quiet moments mattered because much of her day had been shaped around the needs of other people. She knew when her husband needed to leave for work, when the children needed to reach school, when the grocery store closed, when dinner should be served, when bills were due, and when relatives were expected to visit. The household operated according to a schedule that she often carried almost entirely in her head. Long before anyone used phrases such as mental load, women were performing exactly that kind of invisible organizational work, remembering that a child needed new shoes before school began, noticing that toothpaste was nearly finished, knowing which bill had to be mailed on Friday, remembering a neighbor's birthday, planning how yesterday's roast could become tomorrow's sandwiches, and calculating whether enough money remained in the household budget for an unexpected repair, were all small responsibilities that accumulated throughout the week. None of them seemed particularly dramatic on their own, but together they created a constant background of planning. Money management could occupy more time than modern images of the prosperous 1950s suggest. The decade brought rising incomes and expanding consumer culture to many American families, but prosperity was unevenly distributed. Plenty of households lived carefully from paycheck to paycheck. A homemaker might receive a fixed amount of money for groceries and household expenses and be expected to make it last until the next payday. She compared prices, saved coupons, reused containers, repaired clothing, stretched leftovers, and postponed purchases that were not absolutely necessary. A jar, tin, paper bag, piece of ribbon, or length of fabric might be saved because it could become useful later. Clothing was often expected to last. Children's garments could be handed down to younger siblings, hems altered as children grew, buttons replaced rather than allowing a shirt to be discarded, and worn areas patched. Sewing remained an important practical skill in many households. Some women made entire dresses, skirts, curtains, children's outfits, or household decorations themselves, using commercial patterns purchased from stores. A dining table could temporarily become a sewing station, covered with fabric, pins, measuring tape, scissors, and paper patterns. Sewing was not merely an economic necessity. For some women it was creative work, an opportunity to choose colours and styles, and produce something distinctly their own. The same could be true of cooking. Although meal preparation was repetitive, kitchens were also places where traditions moved from one generation to another. Recipes might exist in handwritten notebooks, on index cards, clipped from newspapers, or simply in memory. A mother could prepare something the way her own mother had taught her, adjusting ingredients without measuring because she had made the dish hundreds of times. Family recipes carried histories that rarely appeared in national magazines. Italian-American households, Mexican-American families, Jewish families, black families, families with roots in Eastern Europe, Asia, the American South, rural Appalachia, and countless other communities maintained food traditions that existed alongside the increasingly standardized products promoted by large food companies. The 1950s supermarket shelf might have been filling with canned soup and boxed cake mix, but the American dinner table remained remarkably diverse. Food preservation also continued in many households, especially outside large cities. Women canned fruits, vegetables, jams, pickles, sauces, and preserves. Summer produce could become winter food through hours of washing, cutting, boiling, sterilizing jars, filling them, and carefully sealing them. Home freezers were becoming increasingly popular. allowing families to store meat and produce for longer periods, but preservation remained labor rather than magic. Gardens added another layer to the household routine. A woman living in a rural area or small town might spend part of the morning weeding vegetables, gathering beans, picking tomatoes, collecting eggs, or helping with other farm work before returning inside to continue cooking and cleaning. The suburban housewife and the farm wife might have lived during the same decade, yet their daily routines could feel like entirely different worlds. Life also changed dramatically depending on geography. A woman in a New York apartment might walk downstairs to purchase groceries from neighborhood shops, ride public transportation, carry laundry to a laundromat, and interact with dozens of strangers during the day. A woman in a newly constructed suburb might live on a quiet street where almost every house contained young families. A rural woman might be separated from the nearest town by miles of road. In the South, segregation shaped nearly every part of public life for black women, determining where they could shop, eat, travel, work, and receive services. The cheerful national advertisements presenting a single version of American womanhood ignored these profound differences. The woman smiling beside a new washing machine in a magazine represented an aspiration marketed to a particular audience, not a complete description of the country. Even within middle-class suburbs, domestic life could be surprisingly isolating. Many post-war developments were built around the automobile. Houses stood farther from stores and workplaces, and husbands frequently drove the family's only car to work. A woman could find herself surrounded by hundreds of houses yet unable to travel easily beyond the neighborhood during the day. This helped make informal social life important. Coffee with neighbors was not necessarily evidence that women had nothing better to do. It could provide a break from hours spent alone with small children. A kitchen table became a place where women exchanged advice, gossip, frustrations, recipes, and practical assistance. One woman might complain that her washing machine had stopped working. Another might discuss a child's difficulty at school. Someone might reveal that money was becoming tight. Someone else might be worried about a husband working long hours. These conversations created a support system operating quietly behind the polished suburban exterior. Telephone calls were another connection to the outside world, although using the telephone was very different from carrying a mobile device everywhere. The household telephone was usually fixed to a particular location, perhaps in the hallway or kitchen. Long-distance calls could be expensive and therefore relatively special. Local calls allowed friends and relatives to stay connected, but privacy could be limited, especially when several family members shared the same line. Some communities still used party lines in which multiple households shared a telephone connection. A woman could not simply disappear into a private digital world whenever she became bored. Entertainment and communication were more closely tied to physical places and schedules. Mail, therefore, carried greater emotional importance. Letters connected families separated by distance. A woman might sit at a desk or kitchen table and write several pages describing children, weather, neighborhood news, illnesses, weddings, jobs, and ordinary household events. Photographs could be enclosed. Birthday cards and holiday cards were selected carefully and mailed days in advance. Waiting for a reply could take a week or longer. The daily arrival of the mail carrier brought bills and advertisements, but also the possibility of something personal. A handwritten envelope from a distant friend could change the mood of an afternoon. Reading also occupied more leisure time than the stereotype of endless housework sometimes suggests. Women's magazines were enormously influential, combining fiction, recipes, fashion, decorating advice, celebrity stories, advertisements, and articles about family life. Newspapers delivered local and international events directly to the breakfast table. Libraries offered another important resource. A woman could borrow novels, biographies, cookbooks, and children's books without spending household money. Book clubs and reading groups provided both intellectual engagement and social contact. Some women took correspondence courses, attended evening classes, studied languages, practiced music, painted, or pursued other interests that did not fit neatly into the popular image of domestic life. Religion played a central role in the weekly routines of many families. Churches and other religious institutions were not merely places of worship. They were social centers, charity networks, and community meeting spaces. Women organized meals, taught children, raised funds, prepared decorations, visited sick neighbors, collected clothing for families in need, and participated in committees. Much of this unpaid community labor depended heavily on women. A church supper that appeared effortlessly on tables might represent days of planning, cooking, telephone calls, shopping, and coordination carried out by volunteers. School communities relied on similar labor. There was also a rhythm to the week that made one day different from another, because domestic life in the 1950s was often organized around particular jobs being done on particular days. Monday might be associated with washing, Tuesday with ironing, another day with shopping, and another with heavier cleaning. Although every household developed its own routine, these patterns were partly practical. Laundry could consume so much time that attempting to combine it with several other demanding jobs made little sense. If clothes were being dried outside, weather mattered too. A woman might wake in the morning, look through the window at the sky, and immediately begin calculating whether the sheets could be washed and dried before clouds arrived. Weather forecasts came through radio broadcasts, newspapers, or simple observation rather than an app displaying rain minute by minute. A sudden shower could send someone rushing into the backyard to rescue half-dry laundry from the line. On a good drying day, however, sheets could spend hours in sunlight and return indoors with the crisp feeling associated with line drying. They still needed folding, and some household linens might then be ironed before being placed carefully inside cupboards. Storage itself required organization. Houses were filling with more possessions during the post-war consumer boom, but closets were often smaller than those found in many newer homes today. Clothes, blankets, toys, cleaning equipment, seasonal decorations, suitcases, and household supplies had to be fitted into limited spaces. Women developed elaborate systems for keeping things organized, sometimes using boxes, shelves, trunks, cabinets, and repurposed containers. Nothing was automatically considered disposable, simply because something newer appeared. An old towel might become a cleaning cloth. A worn shirt could provide fabric for another project. Glass jars might hold buttons, leftovers, nails, or homemade preserves. Paper and string could be saved. Habits formed during the Great Depression and wartime shortages did not disappear simply because the economy improved. Many women running households in the 1950s had grown up during the Depression. when wasting food or usable material could feel almost morally wrong. Their children might be growing up surrounded by supermarkets and television advertising, but mothers remembered years when money had been scarce and rationing had shaped everyday decisions. That memory influenced how they cooked, shopped, saved, and planned. Leftovers were rarely thought of as useless. Sunday roast could reappear as sandwiches, hash, soup, or another meal. Stale bread could become breadcrumbs, bread pudding, or stuffing. Bones might flavour broth. Overripe fruit could find its way into desserts. Stretching food was an ordinary household skill, not necessarily a sign of extreme poverty. A skilled homemaker knew how to transform what remained in the refrigerator into something that looked like a new dinner. Refrigerators themselves required attention. They were becoming increasingly common and technologically improved, but not every model operated like a modern frost-free appliance. Some refrigerators required periodic defrosting when ice accumulated around the freezer compartment. This meant removing food, allowing ice to melt, catching water, wiping everything clean, and returning the contents afterward. Even appliances advertised as labor, saving could create their own maintenance rituals. Ovens needed cleaning, toasters collected crumbs. Vacuum cleaners needed bags emptied or replaced. Washing machines could malfunction. Electric mixers required washing after use. The modern kitchen was becoming a collection of machines, but someone still had to operate, clean, and maintain them. Kitchens themselves were changing rapidly. Manufacturers promoted colourful cabinets, chrome, edged tables, vinyl flooring, cheerful curtains, and appliances in fashionable shades. The kitchen increasingly became a symbol of post-war prosperity, and advertisements often treated it almost like a command centre for the modern housewife. Yet a real kitchen at 10 in the morning might look far less glamorous. There could be breakfast dishes drying beside the sink, a child's cup on the table, flour on the counter, laundry soaking nearby, grocery lists held to the refrigerator, and something thawing for dinner. A radio might sit on a shelf, carrying music and conversation into the room. For many women, the kitchen was where a remarkable portion of life happened. Children did homework there. Neighbours drank coffee there. Bills were calculated there. Family arguments happened there. Birthday cakes were decorated there. Bad news was received over the telephone there. Important decisions could be made while someone peeled potatoes. The kitchen was both workplace and social centre, which meant that keeping it presentable required constant effort. The same table used for breakfast might later hold sewing materials, homework, correspondence, vegetables from the garden, and then dinner. Surfaces were continually cleared and repurposed as the day moved forward. Bathrooms created another set of routines. Families often shared a single bathroom, particularly in modest houses. Morning schedules therefore required coordination. Towels needed washing, sinks and tubs needed scrubbing, mirrors needed cleaning, and toiletries had to be replenished. Children's bath nights could become major events, especially in larger families. Water had to be run, pyjamas found, hair washed, arguments settled, and wet floors dried. Hot water supplies were not endless, so several people bathing in succession required planning. Bedrooms needed similar attention. Mattresses might be turned periodically. Blankets were aired. Sheets were changed. Children's rooms accumulated toys, books, clothing, and mysterious objects collected from outdoors. Mothers frequently expected children to help with chores. Although the amount of help varied widely, children could make beds, wash dishes, sweep floors, carry garbage, mow lawns, babysit younger siblings, or help prepare meals. The idea that a 1950s mother personally performed every household task while children played continuously is another oversimplification. Many families considered chores an important part of teaching responsibility. Girls, however, were often assigned more indoor domestic tasks, while boys were directed toward yard work, repairs, or other jobs considered masculine. These divisions taught children expectations they would carry into adulthood. A daughter could learn cooking by standing beside her mother, watching how dough was mixed or vegetables prepared. She might learn sewing by practicing simple stitches or helping attach buttons. A son might be called outside to help his father work on the car or repair a fence. The division was not universal, but it was culturally powerful. For women, teaching daughters household skills could be seen as preparation for adult life because marriage was widely expected. A young woman who could cook, sew, clean, and manage a household was considered well prepared for becoming a wife. At the same time, girls were attending school, reading magazines, watching television, and increasingly imagining futures that extended beyond domestic life. They saw women working as teachers, nurses, secretaries, entertainers, writers, and increasingly in other professions. The messages could be contradictory: be ambitious, but not too ambitious. Be intelligent, but do not intimidate men. Attend college, but remember that marriage is important. Look attractive, but appear effortless. Maintain a perfect home, but never seem exhausted by maintaining it. These contradictions shaped adult women too. A wife might be praised for having an immaculate house, but criticized if she appeared obsessed with housekeeping. She might be encouraged to support her husband's career, while having ambitions of her own treated as secondary. She could be expected to manage household finances carefully, while major financial decisions remained associated with her husband. She was supposed to raise confident children while also keeping them obedient. Much of domestic life involved balancing expectations that could not always be satisfied simultaneously. Social etiquette added another layer. Calling on friends and relatives could involve unwritten rules about timing, clothing, hospitality, and conversation. Thank you notes were expected after certain gifts or visits. Invitations required responses. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, graduations, and anniversaries demanded appropriate clothing and behavior. Women often became the family members responsible for maintaining these social obligations. If a Christmas card needed sending to a distant cousin, a wife might remember it. If a wedding gift needed purchasing, she might select it. If relatives were coming to stay, she prepared the guest room. The social network of the family frequently depended upon her memory. Guests staying overnight could transform an already busy household. Beds needed fresh sheets. Extra meals had to be planned, towels provided, and normal routines adjusted. Yet hospitality could also be enjoyable. Homes filled with conversation, children played with cousins, adults stayed awake late telling stories, and meals became larger and more relaxed. Domestic work and pleasure were often intertwined rather than completely separate. Baking a cake could be exhausting when done under pressure, but enjoyable when performed for someone loved. Sewing could be tedious when repairing a pile of torn clothing yet satisfying when creating a beautiful dress. Cooking dinner every night could become repetitive, while preparing a special holiday meal might carry deep emotional meaning. This complexity is important because descriptions of 1950s domestic life can easily become too simple. Morning could also begin with a kind of private calculation that had little to do with sweeping floors or preparing breakfast. Before anyone else was fully awake, a woman might already be thinking several days ahead. Was there enough milk to reach Friday? Did one of the children need money for a school activity? Was her husband's good shirt ready for an important meeting? Had she remembered to send a birthday card to her mother? Would the roast in the refrigerator be enough for dinner if relatives stopped by? Could the family afford new shoes this month, or would the old pair have to survive a little longer? This constant anticipation was one of the least visible parts of domestic life. A well-run household depended not merely on completing chores, but on noticing problems before they became emergencies. If soap was running low, someone had to notice. If a child's coat was becoming too small, someone had to notice. If the pantry was nearly empty, someone had to notice. In many families, that someone was the woman of the house. She became the keeper of dozens of small facts about the family, carrying them mentally from morning until night. The refrigerator door or kitchen wall often became a primitive information center. Calendars held appointments, birthdays, school events, church meetings, and reminders. Notes might be pinned nearby. Recipes could be tucked into drawers. Telephone numbers were written in address books or on pieces of paper. There was no automatic notification reminding anyone that the dentist appointment was tomorrow afternoon. Forgetting something could mean missing it completely. Household organization therefore depended heavily on memory, routine, handwritten lists, and careful planning. Shopping required its own strategy because stores were not always open late into the evening or around the clock. Sunday opening was restricted in many places, and local customs varied considerably. If something important had been forgotten, obtaining it might have to wait. Women learned to anticipate what would be needed. Grocery lists were built gradually as supplies disappeared. Flour, sugar, coffee, butter, eggs, bread, meat, canned goods, cleaning products, toothpaste, soap, and countless other items moved through the house at different speeds. A large family could consume astonishing quantities of food in a week. The supermarket offered increasing convenience, but many women still shopped at smaller specialized stores, particularly in cities and older neighborhoods. A trip might include the butcher, bakery, produce market, drugstore, and grocery. Shopkeepers sometimes knew customers personally. A butcher could recommend a less expensive cut of meat, or prepare something according to a family's preference. Credit might be extended informally to trusted customers until payday. These relationships made shopping a social activity as well as an economic one. Walking through town meant encountering familiar faces. Someone might stop to discuss a school event. Another person might ask about a sick relative. News traveled through these casual encounters before social media. Neighborhood information could move remarkably quickly through telephone calls, shop conversations, church meetings, school gates, beauty salons, and front porches. Women often stood at the center of these communication networks. The beauty salon was particularly important in many communities. A visit was not simply about hair. It could be a social ritual lasting an hour or more, especially when hair was washed, cut, set, dried, or permanently waved. Women sat beneath large hooded dryers while magazines were passed around, and conversations moved from local gossip to family news. The salon offered something many homemakers lacked during the week, a space filled almost entirely with other adults. Maintaining hairstyles at home could be surprisingly uncomfortable. Women slept in rollers or pins, tied scarves around their hair, used setting lotions, and carefully arranged curls the next morning. Beauty standards emphasized neatness and deliberate grooming. Going downtown, attending church, or visiting friends could involve significantly more preparation than simply leaving the house. Gloves, handbags, hats, stockings, shoes, and coordinated clothing remained part of respectable public dress for many women, depending on age, location, and social class. Stockings themselves could be a source of frustration. A run could ruin an otherwise carefully prepared outfit, and women sometimes tried temporary methods of stopping it from spreading. Clothing maintenance demanded constant attention because garments represented a larger share of household spending than disposable fashion would in later generations. A quality coat might be worn for years. Shoes were repaired rather than automatically replaced. Dresses could be altered. Buttons were saved because they might become useful. A sewing basket therefore contained a miniature emergency department for clothing, needles, thread, scissors, pins, buttons, elastic measuring tape, and scraps of fabric. Small repairs could be completed while listening to the radio or watching television. Socks were darned. Loose hems were stitched. Children's knees were patched. A missing button discovered before school could be replaced in minutes by someone who had performed the task hundreds of times. For women who enjoyed sewing, the skill offered a surprising amount of creative freedom. Bought clothing might be expensive, but patterns allowed someone to reproduce fashionable silhouettes at home. Fabric stores displayed enormous ranges of colors and materials. A woman could study a magazine photograph, select a similar pattern, purchase fabric, and create her own version. The finished dress might appear at church, a wedding, a dinner party, or a family photograph without anyone outside the household knowing how many evenings had gone into making it. Home decoration worked similarly. Curtains could be sewn rather than purchased. Furniture might be recovered. Old pieces were painted or repaired. Women followed decorating trends through magazines and department store displays, but many created attractive homes through ingenuity rather than large budgets. A room could be transformed with new curtains, rearranged furniture, fresh paint, handmade cushions, or flowers from the garden. Flowers occupied an interesting place in domestic life. Fresh flowers from a garden could brighten a table without costing anything. Women planted roses, bulbs, annuals, and flowering shrubs, partly because the appearance of the home extended beyond its walls. Front gardens were visible to neighbours and visitors, and a neat yard contributed to the family's public image. Gardening also provided something domestic chores often did not visible progress. A floor became dirty again, but a plant could grow larger every week. Vegetable gardens had even more practical value. Tomatoes, beans, lettuce, onions, herbs, berries, and other produce could supplement grocery budgets. Children might be sent outside to gather vegetables for dinner. During harvest season, kitchens became temporary processing stations filled with baskets, jars, boiling water, and piles of produce waiting to be preserved. Summer changed household routines considerably. Children were home from school, which meant mothers suddenly had more people in the house throughout the day. Doors opened constantly as children ran outside and returned. Friends appeared unexpectedly. Drinks and snacks disappeared rapidly. Mud, grass, sand, and dust traveled indoors on shoes and clothing. Mothers who had become accustomed to several quiet school hours lost that break until autumn. Yet summer also created freedom. Children could spend hours outdoors with relatively little direct adult supervision. They rode bicycles, played baseball, explored vacant lots, visited friends, climbed trees, or simply disappeared into the neighborhood until someone called them home. Mothers often knew roughly where they were without observing every moment. The neighborhood itself functioned as a loose supervision network. Another mother might notice if something serious happened and telephone the family. Front porches and backyards became important social spaces during warm weather. Adults sat outside in the evening, after houses became too warm. Air conditioning was far from universal, especially early in the decade. A hot summer day could make housework exhausting. Ovens heated kitchens further, so meals might become simpler. Windows were opened, fans operated, curtains moved in the breeze, and cold drinks became especially welcome. Without widespread residential air conditioning, people adapted their schedules to temperature. Heavy cleaning might be completed earlier. Children were encouraged to play outside. Families sat outdoors after sunset. Some slept with windows open, allowing neighborhood sounds to drift into bedrooms. The sound of insects, passing cars, distant radios, and conversations from nearby porches became part of summer nights. Winter produced the opposite challenge. Snow and cold weather brought wet coats, muddy boots, additional laundry, heating concerns, and children trapped indoors. Furnaces required fuel and maintenance. In some houses, certain rooms were warmer than others. Drafts around windows were common. Women prepared heavier meals, managed winter clothing, and tried to keep children occupied when outdoor play became impossible. Weather could alter shopping plans dramatically. A snowstorm meant ensuring that enough food was already in the house. Families without modern forecasting still received warnings through radio and newspapers, but storms could surprise people. A well-stocked pantry offered security canned foods, flour, potatoes, preserved vegetables, and frozen items could carry a household through several days without shopping. There were days, however, when the familiar rhythm of the household was interrupted by something as ordinary as a trip downtown. For a woman in the 1950s, going into the commercial center of a city or town could be an event that required planning. She might finish the most urgent chores early, arrange for someone to watch a small child, check the bus timetable, or make certain the family car would be available. She could change out of the clothes she had worn while cleaning, fix her hair, apply lipstick, collect her handbag and shopping list, and leave behind the private working world of the house for the more public world of streets, shops, restaurants, offices, and department stores. Downtown shopping could involve far more than purchasing necessities. Department stores were carefully designed places of aspiration. Their windows displayed mannequins wearing the latest dresses and coats, while inside were counters filled with perfume, cosmetics, gloves, handbags, jewelry, household linens, kitchen equipment, toys and furniture. Elevators carried shoppers between floors, sometimes operated by uniformed attendants announcing departments as the doors opened. A woman could spend an hour simply looking. She might test perfume, examine a dress she could not afford, compare the price of towels, or study a dining room display, and imagine how something similar might look in her own home. Department stores could include restaurants or tea rooms where women met friends for lunch, making shopping one of the relatively respectable ways to combine errands with leisure. A homemaker who spent most days eating a quick sandwich in her own kitchen could enjoy sitting at a restaurant table while someone else brought the food and removed the dishes afterward. The luxury was not necessarily the meal itself. It was the absence of responsibility for preparing it. For perhaps 40 minutes, she did not need to watch a stove, cut anyone else's food, refill a child's glass, or begin thinking about cleanup. Then she returned to the street and resumed the list of errands folded inside her handbag. There might be shoes to purchase for a child, fabric to examine, medicine to collect from the pharmacy, a bill to pay, or a birthday gift to find. Purchases required judgment because returning an unsuitable item was less convenient than clicking a button from home. Sizes could vary, money was limited, and something purchased today might be expected to last for years. Shoes were especially important. Children's feet grew quickly, and good footwear was expensive enough to matter. Mothers checked whether toes had enough room, considered how rapidly a child might grow, and sometimes bought slightly larger sizes to extend usefulness. Clothing purchases involved similar calculations. Could a coat survive 2 winters? Could a dress be altered later? Could a younger sibling eventually wear it? These questions were part of household economics. The 1950s are often remembered as an age of consumption, but consumption existed alongside habits of preservation. Families bought more goods than earlier generations, yet many still expected those goods to be repaired. A broken radio might go to a repair shop. Shoes went to a cobbler. A malfunctioning toaster could sometimes be fixed. Furniture was reupholstered. Watches were serviced. Appliances were repaired rather than immediately replaced. Women were involved in this repair economy because they were frequently the people noticing when household objects stopped functioning. A vacuum cleaner making a strange noise was not an abstract inconvenience to someone who depended on it every week. If it broke, the workload changed immediately. Until it returned, floors might require sweeping, brushing, or other older methods. The reliability of technology directly affected the physical demands of a woman's day. Electricity itself had transformed domestic life over previous decades, but the transition was uneven. Rural electrification had expanded dramatically, yet memories of earlier methods remained close. Many women in the 1950s had grown up in homes without the appliances their children now considered ordinary. A middle-aged woman operating an electric washing machine might remember her mother spending an entire day doing laundry with tubs, boiling water, washboards, and hand-operated wringers. She could appreciate the machine profoundly while still finding laundry exhausting. Generational comparisons happened constantly. Older relatives sometimes believed younger women had things easy because they had refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, and washing machines. Younger homemakers could look at the amount expected of them and wonder exactly where all the promised leisure had gone. The answer was partly that standards had changed. Families owned more clothing. Children changed clothes more frequently. Homes contained more objects requiring dusting and organization. Expectations surrounding hygiene increased. Advertisements encouraged women to wash, polish, deodorize, sanitize, brighten, soften, and freshen almost everything. Manufacturers were not merely selling cleaning products. They were teaching consumers to notice new categories of dirt. A ring around a bathtub became a problem, requiring a specialized cleaner. Laundry that was clean but not brilliantly white could suddenly seem inadequate. A home without a pleasant artificial scent could be portrayed as embarrassing. Advertising converted ordinary imperfections into personal failures, and then conveniently offered products to solve them. Women learned to navigate these messages with varying degrees of seriousness. Some enthusiastically tried new products. Others trusted methods they had used for years. Friends recommended what actually worked. A cleaning product that performed poorly could be abandoned no matter how cheerful its television commercial appeared. Practical experience remained more powerful than marketing. Certain cleaning methods would surprise people today. Strong chemical products were used with less awareness of some long-term risks. Homes where adults smoked required constant removal of ash and odor. Cigarettes were common at social gatherings, restaurants, workplaces, and even around children. Ashtrays were standard household objects and had to be emptied and washed. Curtains and upholstery could absorb smoke. A hostess preparing for visitors might place clean ashtrays around the living room, almost as automatically as arranging glasses. Smoking was only one example of how different assumptions shaped domestic life. Safety standards for toys, household chemicals, automobiles, and appliances were less developed than they are today. Children rode in cars without modern child seats. Seat belt use was far from universal. Medicines could be stored in places that would now seem careless. Cleaning chemicals came in packaging that sometimes offered limited protection from curious children. Mothers were expected to keep children safe in environments containing risks that later generations would regulate more heavily. Yet children were also given greater physical independence. A school-aged child could leave the house after breakfast on a Saturday, travel several streets away, and return around lunchtime without parents knowing every location visited. Bicycles expanded children's territory enormously. Mothers often relied on rules rather than continuous observation. Stay away from a certain road. Do not go near the river. Come home when the streetlights appear. Tell someone where you are going. This independence reduced some aspects of direct supervision while creating a different kind of worry. A mother might glance through the window when afternoon became evening, wondering why a child had not yet returned. There was no phone in the child's pocket. She could telephone a friend's house, walk down the street, or simply wait another 10 nervous minutes. Childhood accidents were part of life. Scraped knees, cuts, bruises, splinters, burns, and bumps were treated at home when minor. Kitchens often contained simple first aid supplies, and mothers accumulated practical knowledge through experience. A child came crying through the door, and whatever task she had been doing stopped immediately. This unpredictability made domestic schedules fragile. A woman could plan to finish ironing before lunch, only to lose an hour dealing with an injured child, a neighbour's emergency, a telephone call from school, or an appliance failure. Household work therefore demanded flexibility rather than merely discipline. Some days ended with half the planned tasks unfinished. The consequences usually waited until tomorrow. Laundry did not become offended if ignored, but it became a larger pile. Dust remained. Unanswered letters stayed on the desk. The household continually carried unfinished work forward. This created an unusual relationship with time. There was always something else that could be done. Even when the obvious work was finished, cupboards could be reorganized, drawers sorted, clothing repaired, windows washed, silver polished, recipes planned, or closets cleaned. A homemaker had no manager officially announcing that the workday had ended. She had to decide for herself when enough was enough. Often, while cultural messages suggested that a truly dedicated woman should always notice one more thing. Leisure could therefore produce guilt. Sitting down with a novel at 2 in the afternoon might feel indulgent if ironing remained nearby. A woman watching television could simultaneously fold towels, so the time still seemed productive. Knitting, sewing, embroidery, and crochet became particularly compatible with this mindset because they allowed relaxation while producing something useful. Hands remained busy even during rest. Handmade objects accumulated across homes, blankets, sweaters, scarves, baby clothing, table coverings, decorative pieces, and gifts. There were also the small morning rituals that rarely made their way into photographs, but quietly shaped the beginning of every day. A woman might stand for a moment beside the kitchen window while coffee heated, watching the neighborhood slowly wake. A newspaper landed near the front door. Somewhere down the street, a car engine started. A dog barked behind a fence. Curtains opened in neighboring houses one after another. The world outside appeared calm, but inside kitchens across the neighborhood, dozens of women were already moving through nearly identical sequences of preparation. Cups were placed on tables, lunches wrapped, children reminded of the time, and husbands searched for keys, wallets, hats, papers, or whatever else had mysteriously disappeared overnight. Even before the official workday began outside the home, considerable work had already been completed inside it. Breakfast itself could create an impressive amount of cleanup. Coffee grounds, frying pans, plates, cereal bowls, glasses, crumbs, and spills remained after everyone rushed away. The sudden silence following the departure of schoolchildren and working adults could feel almost dramatic. One moment the kitchen was filled with questions and movement. The next there was only the ticking clock and a collection of dirty dishes for a mother with a baby or toddler. Of course, silence was unlikely to last. The youngest child might still be eating breakfast, demanding attention just as she began cleaning everything the rest of the family had left behind. Babies impose their own schedules regardless of household plans. Feeding, changing, bathing, soothing, and putting a baby down for naps could divide the day into short, unpredictable sections. A mother learned to work rapidly during those precious periods. When a baby slept, the moment the child became quiet, she might hurry toward whatever job was most difficult to complete while carrying or supervising an infant. Laundry was started, floors were cleaned, food was prepared, a letter was written. Sometimes she faced a choice between completing chores and resting herself. Advice might suggest that mothers sleep when babies slept, but a sink full of dishes and a basket of clothing could make that recommendation feel unrealistic. Exhaustion was therefore familiar to many young mothers. Night feeding interrupted sleep, and there was little cultural expectation that normal household standards should disappear simply because a woman was tired. She might wake repeatedly during the night, and still rise early enough to prepare breakfast. Her husband might have to work in the morning, which often became the reason she handled most nighttime care. Whether that arrangement felt fair depended on the couple, but it was common enough to be treated as ordinary. Childcare outside the family was more limited than it would become later. Daycare existed, particularly for working mothers, but many middle-class families assumed that young children would remain with their mothers. Relatives could provide crucial help. A grandmother living nearby might take a baby for an afternoon, allowing the mother to shop alone, visit the doctor, or simply recover from several difficult nights. Sisters and sisters. In-law exchanged childcare. Neighbours watched one another's children informally. These relationships formed an unofficial system supporting families before organised childcare became as widespread. The arrangement worked best when people had reliable relatives or neighbours. Women without those networks could become intensely isolated. Imagine spending an entire winter day inside a small house with 2 young children, no car, no internet, no private television in another room, and perhaps only a telephone and radio connecting you to adults elsewhere. Snow covered the street. The children were restless, and your husband would not return until evening. Even a woman who loved motherhood could find such days. This helps explain why seemingly trivial social rituals carried real importance. A friend arriving for coffee was not simply wasting an afternoon. She brought adult conversation into a repetitive environment. The women could sit at the kitchen table while children played nearby, exchanging stories about neighbours, husbands, money, television, recipes, relatives, and whatever else occupied their minds. Coffee might last 20 minutes or 2 hours, depending on the day. If one child began crying, both women could continue the conversation almost automatically while solving the problem. Friendships adapted themselves around interruption. Coffee culture inside the home was complemented by occasional restaurant lunches, soda fountains, diners, and department store tea rooms. A simple lunch outside could feel special precisely because it removed the obligation to cook. Diners offered sandwiches, soups, pies, coffee, and other familiar foods. Sitting in a booth with a friend while someone else carried away, the plate represented a temporary reversal of the normal domestic arrangement. Sometimes women met after shopping. Sometimes working women ate lunch with colleagues. Sometimes mothers brought children along and spent the meal attempting to keep them reasonably quiet. Eating in public with young children could create its own pressure because children's behavior was treated as evidence of parental discipline. A child throwing food or screaming in a restaurant attracted attention, and mothers often felt those glances personally. Public judgment followed women to many areas of parenting. A child wearing dirty clothing, behaving rudely, struggling at school, gaining too much weight, appearing too thin, or simply being unusually energetic could produce unsolicited advice. Mothers received opinions from relatives, teachers, doctors, neighbours, magazines, and strangers. Child-rearing experts offered confident recommendations that sometimes contradicted what an earlier generation had taught. A grandmother might insist that a baby needed one thing, while a paediatrician recommended another. The mother stood between tradition and modern expertise, expected to make the correct decision. Feeding babies was one area of changing advice. Commercial baby foods became increasingly common and convenient. Rows of small jars offered carefully prepared fruits, vegetables, and meats. Formula feeding also expanded during the mid-century period, encouraged by medical practices and advertising. Although experiences differed widely, bottles required cleaning and preparation, adding another repetitive task to the kitchen. A row of sterilized bottles could become as ordinary a sight as coffee cups. As babies grew, feeding remained messy. High chairs collected crumbs. Mashed vegetables landed on floors. Bibs entered the laundry. A woman could clean the kitchen after breakfast, only to watch a toddler undo the result 15 minutes later. This cycle between order and disorder defined much of life with small children. Toys presented another challenge. The post-war baby boom created an enormous market for children's products. Dolls, trucks, blocks, puzzles, bicycles, model trains, games, stuffed animals, and countless other toys entered homes. Christmas intensified the collection every year. Storage was limited, so mothers developed baskets, boxes, shelves, and rules designed to prevent living rooms from becoming permanent playrooms. Children did not always cooperate. Cleaning up toys could become part of evening discipline, with mothers insisting that everything be put away before bed. Bedrooms were not necessarily private kingdoms where children could leave endless disorder. Parents frequently expected beds to be made and floors reasonably clear. Saturday mornings might include family chores before children were allowed to disappear outside. The concept of allowance was common in some households, giving children small amounts of money in exchange for chores, or as part of teaching financial responsibility. A child could save coins for candy, comics, toys, or trips to the cinema. Mothers sometimes supervised these tiny budgets, encouraging saving while knowing that most of the money would probably disappear at a neighborhood store. Children's independence in shopping could surprise modern observers. A mother might send an older child to a nearby store carrying a handwritten note and some cash. The child returned with bread, milk, or another forgotten ingredient. This gave mothers a practical assistant while teaching children responsibility. It also reflected neighborhoods where stores were often closer, and children were trusted to navigate local streets alone. Errands were distributed throughout family life. Someone returned library books. Someone mailed a letter. Someone carried bottles for deposits where applicable. Children collected newspapers from the porch and brought groceries inside. Household management was primarily the woman's responsibility in many families, but she could delegate pieces of the work. Older daughters often carried particularly heavy expectations. A teenage girl might help cook, wash dishes, iron, or care for younger siblings. Babysitting brothers and sisters could become routine rather than optional. This domestic training was considered preparation for her own adulthood, though it sometimes produced resentment when brothers enjoyed greater freedom. A daughter watching her mother could learn both practical skills and an early lesson about gender. She saw who stood up when the baby cried. She saw who cleared the dinner table. She saw who remembered birthdays. She saw who relaxed after dinner and who continued working. These observations mattered because children absorb social rules long before anyone formally explains them. Yet families varied enormously. Some fathers cooked, some husbands washed dishes, some enjoyed caring for babies. Some couples divided work more evenly than cultural stereotypes suggest. There was another part of the day that became visible only when something went wrong. Because much of a woman's work in the 1950s involved preventing small household problems from turning into large ones. A loose button was fixed before it disappeared. A nearly empty pantry was noticed before breakfast supplies ran out. A child's cough was watched before deciding whether a doctor was necessary. A stain was treated before it became permanent. A bill was placed somewhere it would not be forgotten. A strange noise from an appliance was remembered and mentioned later. The smooth operation of family life depended on hundreds of observations like these. And because problems were usually solved before becoming serious, the work involved could become almost invisible. If everyone reached school and worked with clean clothing and enough food, nobody necessarily thought about how many decisions had made that possible. The household simply seemed to function. Yet behind that appearance was even something as simple as preparing children for changing weather required planning. A cool morning could become a warm afternoon. Rain might arrive while children were at school. Coats, sweaters, boots, umbrellas, gloves, scarves, and hats had to be located before they were needed. Children's clothing had an irritating habit of disappearing precisely when the school bus was approaching. One glove remained while its partner vanished. A raincoat hung somewhere unexpected. A shoe had been pushed beneath a bed. A mother could begin the morning calmly and find herself several minutes later searching through bedrooms while calling reminders down the hallway. Once the door finally closed behind the children, she might discover the missing glove sitting plainly on a chair. Such tiny episodes rarely appear in historical accounts, but they formed the texture of ordinary family life. School itself generated a steady flow of objects into the home. Papers, drawings, textbooks, report cards, permission slips, notices, lunchboxes, sports equipment, musical instruments, and craft projects appeared almost daily. Someone had to decide what should be saved and what could be discarded. Children's artwork might be displayed temporarily on a refrigerator or wall, though magnetic refrigerator doors were not universal. In the way modern households assume, important papers were placed somewhere safe. Lunch boxes needed cleaning. Thermos bottles had to be washed carefully. Lost schoolbooks created panic because replacing them could cost money. A child who announced at bedtime that a costume was needed tomorrow could produce an entirely new evening project. Mothers improvised with old clothing, fabric, scraps, cardboard, paper, glue, and whatever else could be found. The ability to make something useful from ordinary household materials was highly valuable. Stores offered fewer instantly available solutions, and there was no late-night online order arriving at the door. The next morning, if something was needed urgently, the family either already had it, borrowed it from someone nearby, made it, or went without. Borrowing was therefore an ordinary part of neighborhood life. A cup of sugar, an egg, a ladder, a cake pan, a tool, a pattern, a children's costume, or an extra chair could travel between houses. Borrowed objects were expected to be returned, and often a small favor generated another in the future. These exchanges created a web of mutual dependence that made neighborhoods feel more socially connected. Privacy was valued, but complete independence was neither expected nor always practical. If a telephone stopped working or a car refused to start, the nearest neighbor could become essential. A woman whose husband had taken the family car to work might ask another mother for a ride to the doctor. Someone going downtown could offer to collect an item for a friend. Children moved between houses carrying messages. Community life functioned through countless favors that never involved money. The arrival of a new family on the street could therefore be significant. Neighbors noticed the moving truck, speculated about who was arriving, and often introduced themselves. A cake, pie, casserole, or plate of cookies might be brought over as a welcome. Women were frequently the first people to establish these relationships because they spent more daytime hours in the neighborhood. Within weeks, a newcomer might know which grocery store had the best meat, which doctor people trusted, which teacher was strict, when garbage was collected, and who could be called in an emergency. Local knowledge moved person to person. This was particularly valuable in the rapidly expanding suburbs, where many residents had recently moved away from older city neighborhoods and extended families. The new suburban house promised privacy and space, but it could also remove young mothers from the relatives who had traditionally helped them. Neighbors sometimes became substitute family. A woman could borrow not only sugar but reassurance. If a baby developed an unfamiliar rash, an experienced mother living 2 doors away might be consulted before anyone telephoned the doctor. If a child refused to eat, another mother might describe what had worked for her. Parenting knowledge circulated informally through these conversations, sometimes reinforcing good practices and sometimes passing along questionable ones. Medical advice was changing quickly during the decade, and not every household accepted new recommendations immediately. Doctors themselves occupied a position of considerable authority. A physician's instructions might be followed with little questioning. Women often became the people responsible for carrying those instructions into daily life, measuring medicine, changing diets, monitoring symptoms, or ensuring that children rested. A doctor's appointment required preparation. Children had to be dressed, transportation arranged, and perhaps other children left with someone. Waiting rooms could consume a large portion of the morning. Then there was the pharmacy, where prescriptions were filled and household remedies purchased. Medicine cabinets contained familiar products for headaches, coughs, cuts, indigestion, and other minor problems. Health management was another responsibility woven quietly into domestic life. Dental care produced its own appointments and expenses. Children's teeth were monitored, and orthodontic treatment was becoming increasingly visible among middle-class families. A mother might spend an afternoon sitting in a dental waiting room with a magazine, while a child underwent treatment, knowing dinner still had to be prepared afterward. Appointments rarely replaced domestic tasks. They merely compressed the remaining time. A day spent outside running errands could therefore feel more exhausting than a day at home. Returning through the door with shopping bags did not mean the work was finished. Groceries needed storing, children needed attention, and dinner time had moved closer. There was often a frantic period in late afternoon when several demands arrived simultaneously. The telephone rang. Someone needed help with homework. A younger child became hungry. Laundry remained outside. Something needed thawing. A neighbor appeared at the door. The clock seemed to move faster after 4 o'clock. Experienced homemakers learned to prepare parts of dinner earlier in the day to reduce this pressure. Vegetables could be peeled in advance. Desserts were made during quieter morning hours. Casseroles could be assembled and refrigerated until baking time. A roast could cook slowly while other work continued. Meal planning was partly about food and partly about managing time. Recipes promising quick preparation therefore attracted attention. Food companies understood this and increasingly marketed convenience as freedom. Canned soup became a source. Packaged mixes reduced measuring. Frozen vegetables eliminated peeling and chopping. Cake mixes promised reliable desserts without assembling every ingredient individually. Some consumers embraced these innovations immediately. Others considered scratch cooking superior. There could even be a subtle moral dimension to convenience. If a woman used too many shortcuts, was she being lazy? If she refused them, was she wasting time? The modern housewife was somehow expected to be efficient and traditional at the same time. Cake mixes provide an especially interesting example of this tension. Manufacturers discovered that consumers did not always want preparation to become completely effortless. Part of the satisfaction of baking came from feeling that something had actually been made. Products were therefore marketed in ways that allowed the cook to participate, rather than simply open a package. Convenience succeeded best when it saved labor without eliminating the sense of personal contribution. Presentation mattered too. A packaged cake could be decorated with homemade frosting and served on a favorite plate, transforming an industrial product into something personal. The same process happened across the kitchen. Canned ingredients became family recipes. Frozen foods were combined with fresh ones. Modern convenience and older cooking traditions existed side by side. Women adapted products rather than simply following advertisements. Cookbooks reflected this mixture. Some contained recipes requiring hours of preparation, while others celebrated speed. Church and community cookbooks were especially revealing, because recipes came from actual households. Names appeared beside dishes, connecting food with particular women. A casserole might become permanently associated with one neighbor, a pie with an aunt, a cookie recipe with a grandmother. Food carried identity. Sharing recipes was therefore a form of social exchange. A woman tasted something at a gathering and asked how it was made. And there were mornings when nothing dramatic happened at all, which may be the most accurate way to understand everyday life in the 1950s. No appliance broke, no child became sick, no unexpected visitor knocked at the door, and no family crisis interrupted the schedule. The day simply unfolded through familiar movements that had been repeated so often. They required little conscious thought. A woman could walk into the kitchen half awake and know exactly which cupboard contained the coffee, which child preferred which cereal, how many slices of bread remained, and how long she had before everyone needed to leave. She recognized the sounds of the house. She knew which floorboard creaked, which door needed an extra push to close, whether the furnace sounded normal, and whether the washing machine had reached the part of its cycle when she needed to return. Familiarity turned the home into a place she understood almost physically, and this knowledge allowed her to manage several things at once. She might hear a pot beginning to boil while helping a child fasten a coat. Remember that a letter needed mailing while wiping the breakfast table, and mentally add butter to the grocery list after noticing how little remained. Domestic skill often looked effortless because repetition had transformed complicated sequences into habit. Cooking was perhaps the clearest example. An experienced cook did not necessarily consult a recipe every time she prepared dinner. Her hands knew what to do. She could judge the consistency of dough by touch, recognize when a pan was hot enough, estimate quantities by sight, and tell from smell that something in the oven was nearly finished. She understood which inexpensive cuts of meat required long cooking and which vegetables would keep for several days. She knew how much food her family would actually eat, which child disliked onions, and whether her husband would want another helping. None of this knowledge appeared on a certificate, but it represented years of accumulated experience. The same was true of laundry. A woman learned which fabrics could tolerate hot water, which colors might run, which stains required immediate treatment, and which garments should never be washed together. Clothing labels existed, but practical knowledge remained essential. A mistake could ruin an expensive garment. White shirts demanded special attention because brightness was associated with cleanliness, and advertisements relentlessly reminded women of it. Starch might be used to create crisp collars and cuffs. Ironing required understanding temperature, because too much heat could scorch fabric while too little accomplished. Nothing, an experienced woman moved the iron quickly, pulling fabric flat with one hand and pressing with the other, turning sleeves and collars with a precision learned through hundreds of repetitions. Ironing could become almost meditative when there was no rush. The radio played, sunlight entered the room, and a growing stack of finished clothing provided visible evidence of progress. But on hot summer days, standing beside a heated iron could be miserable. Without air conditioning, the combination of humidity, steam, and heat made even ordinary chores physically draining. Windows were opened, fans operated, and women sometimes arranged work, so the hottest tasks happened early. Baking could be postponed until evening or avoided entirely during severe heat. Cold meals, sandwiches, salads, fruit and foods prepared without long oven use became practical choices. Seasonal adaptation shaped domestic life more strongly than modern climate. Controlled houses suggest winter mornings created different problems. A woman might wake before sunrise and enter a cold kitchen, waiting for the heating system to make the house comfortable. Children resisted leaving warm beds. Heavy clothing multiplied the morning preparation. Boots needed locating wet garments from yesterday might still be drying. Snow tracked indoors and melted into puddles. Floors required more cleaning. Windows fogged. The home became a fortress against weather, and keeping it comfortable required attention. Heating costs mattered, so thermostats were not always kept as high as people might prefer. Sweaters were worn indoors. Certain rooms could remain cooler when unused. Blankets accumulated on beds. Women monitored fuel supplies in homes using oil, coal, or other heating systems depending on region and housing. A failure during winter was more than an inconvenience. It could become an emergency requiring immediate help. Knowing whom to call was therefore part of household management. Telephone books sat near the phone, thick directories filled with names, numbers, advertisements, and business listings. When a plumber, electrician, repairman, doctor, taxi, or shop was needed, the directory provided the connection. Women who managed homes often became the people communicating with tradesmen, describing problems, arranging appointments, and waiting for someone to arrive. Waiting could consume hours because appointment windows were imprecise. A repairman might promise to come sometime in the afternoon, effectively trapping the homemaker inside until he appeared. When he finally arrived, she explained the problem and perhaps watched carefully because repairs cost money, and she wanted to understand what had failed. Home ownership created a constant stream of such concerns. Roofs leaked, pipes clogged, paint peeled, screens tore, faucets dripped, furnaces needed servicing, gutters filled, appliances aged. Husbands often handled weekend repairs, particularly in families influenced by traditional gender roles. But wives were usually the people living with problems during the day and deciding which ones could wait. The expanding do-it-yourself culture encouraged families to perform more maintenance themselves. Hardware stores sold tools and supplies, while magazines offered instructions for improving homes. Couples painted rooms, built shelves, repaired furniture, landscaped yards, and transformed unfinished spaces. A new suburban house might initially look sparse because furnishing it completely was expensive. Families acquired pieces gradually. A dining set one year, a television the next, better curtains later. The polished rooms shown in advertisements represented goals more often than immediate reality. Newly married couples frequently began with hand-me-down furniture donated by parents and relatives. An old table could be covered with a cloth. Mismatched chairs worked perfectly well. A second-hand sofa remained until money allowed replacement. Women used decorating skills to make imperfect collections feel intentional. Wedding gifts helped establish households. Towels, sheets, dishes, cookware, silverware, small appliances, and linens were practical presents because newlyweds needed almost everything. Bridal showers reinforced this process, surrounding a young woman with household objects that symbolized her expected future responsibilities. A toaster or mixing bowl could be presented almost as a tool of adulthood. Marriage often meant learning household management rapidly. A woman who had lived with her parents might suddenly become responsible for an entire home. Some arrived well prepared after years of helping their mothers. Others barely knew how to cook. Early marriage could therefore contain comic disasters, burned dinners, shrinking clothes, cakes that collapsed, budgets that failed, and frantic telephone calls to mothers asking how long something should remain in the oven. Experience accumulated quickly because mistakes had immediate consequences. Cookbooks became teachers, so did relatives and neighbors. Recipes were exchanged, household tricks passed along, and confidence gradually developed. A young wife could look back after several years and realize that tasks once intimidating had become automatic. Motherhood created another dramatic learning curve. No amount of advice completely prepared someone for bringing a baby home. Suddenly, the household revolved around feeding, crying, sleeping, diapers, bottles, laundry. New mothers could feel enormous pressure to appear naturally competent, because motherhood was portrayed as instinctive. In reality, they learned through trial, observation, advice, and mistakes. Babies refused schedules. They cried for reasons adults could not identify. A mother could spend an hour soothing a child and then wonder whether she had accomplished anything all morning. Yet caring itself was the accomplishment, even if no cleaned room or completed task demonstrated it. The emotional intensity of motherhood could contrast sharply with its repetitive physical routine. Feeding a baby at 2 a.m. was exhausting, but the quiet closeness could also become a treasured memory. A toddler's constant questions could become irritating, then suddenly funny. A child learning to read could transform an ordinary evening into a moment of enormous pride. Domestic life contained these emotional rewards precisely alongside the labor. Children also forced women to become teachers long before homework formally began. Mothers taught words, manners, colors, numbers, prayers in religious households, songs, simple tasks, and rules about safety. They read picture books, answered questions, corrected behavior, and demonstrated how everyday objects worked. Much early education happened casually while cooking, walking, shopping, or folding clothes. A child sitting at the kitchen table could learn to count using buttons while the mother repaired clothing. Baking introduced measurements. Grocery shopping introduced money. Gardening introduced seasons and plants. Household life was full of informal lessons. Mothers were also responsible for social education. There was also something deeply revealing about the way women prepared for visitors, because a knock at the door could transform an ordinary afternoon almost instantly. In many communities, people visited one another with less advance notice than would be common today. A relative passing through town might stop by. A neighbour could appear for coffee. Someone from church might come to discuss an event. A salesperson might ring the bell. The possibility of unexpected company gave household appearance a social importance beyond personal preference. A living room was not simply where the family relaxed. It was also the room through which outsiders might judge the household. Cushions were straightened, newspapers gathered, toys moved away, and obvious clutter quickly hidden. If there was enough warning, a woman might change from a practical house dress or work clothes into something cleaner, brush her hair, and apply a little lipstick before opening the door. This did not mean women spent their days formally dressed. It meant that public presentation and private work were often treated as separate worlds. The apron could come off, the hair could be adjusted, and within minutes, the person who had been scrubbing a floor could appear ready to receive company. Hospitality followed almost automatically. Coffee was offered, tea might be prepared, cookies, cake, crackers, or whatever happened to be available could appear on a plate. A woman who knew visitors were coming might bake specifically for them, and many households kept something available precisely because guests could arrive unexpectedly. Offering nothing could feel inhospitable. The ritual mattered even when the visitor declined. It communicated welcome. These visits created interruptions, but they could also rescue a dull afternoon. Two women might begin with polite conversation and gradually move into the subjects that actually interested them. Children, marriages, television programs, recipes, neighborhood events, family disagreements, prices at the supermarket, local gossip, and worries about the future could all enter the conversation. A visitor who intended to stay 15 minutes might remain for 2 hours. The unfinished cleaning waited patiently in another room. In that sense, domestic life contained a tension between productivity and companionship. A woman could always find another task to complete, but relationships required time that produced nothing visible. Friendship was valuable precisely because it interrupted the endless cycle of useful work. Some women developed regular visiting patterns. Wednesday morning might mean coffee with one neighbour. Friday afternoon could involve a bridge group. Certain evenings belonged to church meetings or clubs. These recurring events divided the week into recognizable pieces and provided something to anticipate. Without them, days spent primarily at home could blur together. Social calendars therefore mattered psychologically as much as practically. Bridge, canasta, and other card games became especially popular forms of adult socializing. A card table could be unfolded in the living room, snacks prepared, and friends invited over. The game provided structure while conversation continued around it. Women could become fiercely competitive, remembering scores and discussing previous games for weeks. These gatherings were not simply decorative scenes from suburban life. They created spaces where women could build friendships independent of husbands and children. Sometimes husbands participated in evening card parties, but daytime groups often belonged primarily to women. Food accompanied almost everything. A hostess might prepare sandwiches cut into small shapes, cakes, cookies, nuts, coffee, or other refreshments. Even leisure therefore generated domestic labor. Someone washed the cups after everyone left, yet many women considered the effort worthwhile because entertaining transformed the home from a workplace into a social space. The same kitchen that had felt isolating in the morning could become warm and noisy when friends gathered around the table. Birthdays provided another transformation. Children's birthdays could involve homemade cakes, candles, paper decorations, games, small prizes, and groups of excited children running through the house. Planning began days beforehand. Invitations were distributed, food selected, and the house prepared for chaos. A mother might spend an entire morning decorating a cake only to watch children consume it in minutes. She organized games, settled arguments, cleaned spills, opened doors for arriving parents, and made sure nobody felt excluded. When the final guest left, the room could look as though a storm had passed through it. Torn wrapping paper, cups, crumbs, toys, and decorations covered surfaces. The birthday child was delighted and exhausted. The mother began cleaning. Yet these celebrations became part of family memory, which gave the labor meaning. The cake visible in an old photograph might have represented 3 hours of work, but decades later the photograph preserved the smile rather than the effort. Children's clothing for special events required similar preparation. A school performance, family wedding, church ceremony, or holiday photograph could mean ironing dresses, polishing shoes, locating matching socks, fixing hems, and making sure everyone remained clean long enough to leave the house. Mothers learned the danger of dressing small children too early. A perfectly prepared child could find mud, jam, or dust within minutes. Experienced mothers sometimes kept special clothing protected until the last possible moment. Then came the race to get everyone dressed and out the door before something went wrong. Family photographs demanded particular patience. Cameras used film, so people did not take dozens of images and immediately choose the best. Each photograph cost something to develop, and nobody knew exactly how it looked until the film returned later. Children were instructed to stand still. Adults arranged themselves carefully. Someone inevitably blinked. The resulting image might still be kept for decades because photographs were relatively precious. Women frequently became guardians of these family records. Prints were placed into albums, sometimes with dates or names written beside them. Loose photographs were stored in boxes or envelopes. School portraits were mailed to relatives. Wedding photographs occupied special albums. Over time, these collections became visual histories of families, and women often remembered who everyone was when younger generations no longer did. Memory maintenance was another quiet responsibility. Someone had to remember which cousin had moved to another state when an aunt's anniversary occurred, who had recently been ill, and which relative needed a letter. Family networks did not maintain themselves automatically. Women often performed the communication that kept distant relatives connected. A husband might know that his sister had moved without remembering her new address because his wife had written it in the family book. Christmas intensified this communication. Cards could be sent to dozens of people. Selecting, addressing, signing, stamping, and mailing them took hours. Some families included letters summarizing the year's events. Receiving cards became part of the season, and they could be displayed around the house. Each envelope represented a relationship being renewed across distance. Christmas preparation itself could begin weeks in advance. Gifts had to be chosen according to budget, hidden from children, wrapped, labelled, and sometimes mailed. Homemade gifts required even earlier preparation. Sweaters were knitted, clothing sewn, preserves packaged, cookies baked, and decorations created. Children expected magic on Christmas morning, and mothers often did a remarkable amount of work to produce it. Stockings were filled after children slept, presents appeared beneath trees, breakfast was prepared, relatives arrived, dinner followed. By evening, photographs showed smiling families surrounded by gifts, while the person who had helped create the entire scene might be running on very little sleep. The cultural expectation that women should make holidays special could be both rewarding and exhausting. Thanksgiving, Easter, birthdays, anniversaries, and other celebrations each carried their own traditions. Maintaining them gave family life continuity. Children measured years through repeated rituals. Certain dishes appeared at certain times. Decorations emerged from storage. Relatives sat in familiar seats. Women frequently became the organizers who ensured these repetitions happened. Seasonal storage therefore occupied surprising amounts of domestic attention. Decorations, winter blankets, summer clothing, school supplies, picnic equipment, and holiday dishes had to be packed somewhere. Basements, attics, closets, garages, trunks, and cupboards became carefully managed storage systems. Opening an old box could reveal pieces of family history. A child's outgrown shoes, letters, photographs, a wedding veil, baby clothing, decorations made years earlier. Women often decided what should be saved. This could be emotional work. Throwing away a child's first dress or a stack of old letters was not merely clearing clutter. Objects carried memory. The post-war consumer boom made this increasingly complicated because households accumulated more possessions than earlier generations had. New toys, appliances, clothing, records, books, and decorative items entered homes every year. Storage space did not necessarily expand at the same speed. Periodic sorting became essential. Closets were emptied. Clothing was divided into categories: keep, repair, hand down, donate, or discard. Charitable organizations received usable garments. Younger relatives inherited children's clothing. Nothing useful needed to be wasted. Perhaps one of the easiest ways to understand a woman's day in the 1950s is to imagine not the major chores, but the constant movement between them. Very little happened in a perfectly organized sequence. She did not necessarily finish breakfast, then finish laundry, then finish cleaning, and then calmly begin lunch. Real household life. A load of washing could be running while bread was being prepared. A child could interrupt both. The telephone might ring, and someone could arrive at the front door before any of those tasks were finished. She learned to leave one job halfway through and return 20 minutes later without forgetting where she had stopped. A saucepan could be removed from the heat while she answered the telephone. Laundry could remain in a basket while she comforted a crying child. Half-written letters waited beside unfinished cups of coffee. The day was made of interruptions, and the ability to recover from them was one of the most important household skills. The telephone was particularly capable of changing a morning. Its ring was loud and impossible to ignore, and because there was no caller identification, answering it contained a tiny element of mystery. It might be a neighbor asking for help, A relative with news, a school reporting that a child was sick, a husband calling from work, or simply someone who wanted to talk. A conversation could last 2 minutes or 40. Long telephone cords sometimes allowed a woman to move around the kitchen while speaking, but many phones remained fixed to a wall or table, forcing her to stop what she was doing. If the call was important, the rest of the schedule simply shifted. Telephone etiquette could be more formal than modern habits. People identified themselves, asked whether it was a convenient time, and sometimes kept small message pads near the phone. Children were taught how to answer politely. Teenagers created a new problem by occupying the family telephone for long conversations with friends. A mother waiting for an important call might repeatedly tell a daughter to get off the line because one telephone served the entire household. Communication itself became something family members negotiated. Privacy was limited. A teenager talking to a boyfriend might stretch the cord as far as possible into a hallway while hoping nobody listened. Parents could usually tell who was calling simply from the tone of the conversation. Mothers sometimes became accidental witnesses to their children's developing social lives. The telephone could also become an instrument of neighborhood organization. If a school event needed volunteers, one woman called another, who called another. News traveled through chains of conversations. Church committees organized dinners this way. Political groups arranged meetings. Parents coordinated rides. A telephone tree could spread information across a neighborhood remarkably quickly without any centralized technology. Women frequently operated these networks because they were available during daytime hours. A seemingly casual hour spent on the phone could therefore involve genuine organizational work. Doorbells created similar interruptions. Delivery workers, repairmen, salespeople, neighbors, children selling items for school, religious visitors, and unexpected relatives could all appear. A woman working alone in the house had to decide whether to answer and how long the interaction would last. Door selling was common enough that many homemakers developed practiced ways of refusing products without creating an argument. Others welcomed demonstrations, especially when the product genuinely seemed useful. Vacuum cleaners, kitchen products, cosmetics, encyclopedias, and household goods could all be sold directly inside the home. Some demonstrations turned into organized parties where friends gathered around a salesperson, combining shopping with social entertainment. Women themselves often became sellers. Direct sales companies offered opportunities to earn money with schedules that could fit around children. A woman might host demonstrations in living rooms, take orders from neighbors, and receive commissions. The work depended heavily on social networks. Friends became customers, and customers sometimes became friends. Success required confidence, organization, and persuasive skill, qualities that contradicted the idea of the passive housewife. Small-scale entrepreneurship existed throughout neighborhoods, in less formal ways as well. Someone baked cakes for other families. Someone altered dresses. Someone watched children. Someone styled hair from home. Someone took in ironing. Someone made curtains. Someone sold eggs or garden produce. Someone typed documents for local businesses. These activities generated money without necessarily appearing as conventional employment. Household economies were more complicated than a single paycheck coming through the front door. Extra income could be particularly valuable before holidays or when saving for something large. A woman might quietly place earnings into a jar or savings account intended for a vacation, children's education, furniture, or emergencies. Saving itself required patience because many desired objects were not purchased immediately. Families could spend months planning for a television or washing machine. The eventual purchase became an event. Children gathered around a new television set with excitement. A woman receiving her first automatic washer might invite a neighbor to see it. New appliances represented progress in a tangible form. They also became status symbols because visitors could see them. Consumer goods communicated economic success, especially in neighborhoods where houses themselves looked similar. The car in the driveway, television in the living room, refrigerator in the kitchen, and furniture throughout the house quietly revealed what a family could afford. This encouraged comparison. A neighbor's new appliance could inspire admiration and uncomfortable envy at the same time. Advertising amplified the feeling by suggesting that modern families were constantly upgrading. Yet many households resisted the pressure simply because budgets demanded it. An old refrigerator that still worked remained in the kitchen. Furniture survived for decades. A television was repaired. Families learned to distinguish between wanting something and being able to justify it. Women often became the practical voices in these decisions because they knew exactly what remained in the household budget. Catalogues allowed desires to be examined without immediate purchase. Pages could be turned slowly, items circled, and possibilities discussed. Children studied toy sections before Christmas. Women examined clothing, curtains, appliances, and household equipment. Rural families relied particularly heavily on mail order shopping, but catalogues reached homes everywhere. They were entertainment as much as commerce, allowing people to imagine possessions they might never buy. Window shopping served the same purpose. A woman could admire a beautifully arranged living room display in a department store and return home with nothing more than an idea for rearranging her own furniture. Creativity compensated for limited spending. A new lampshade, different curtains, or freshly painted wall could make an old room feel new. Home decoration became one of the culturally acceptable areas where women exercised substantial aesthetic control. They selected colors, fabrics, furniture arrangements, dishes, and decorative objects. The result communicated personality even within standardized suburban architecture. Two identical houses could feel completely different inside. One family preferred modern furniture and clean lines. Another filled rooms with inherited pieces. Someone loved floral fabrics. Someone else preferred simpler designs. Magazines promoted trends, but households adapted them. The kitchen could be turquoise, yellow, pink, red, or another fashionable color. Chrome and vinyl appeared beside older wooden furniture. Plastic products became increasingly common and carried a futuristic appeal. The post-war home was a mixture of tradition and modernity. Women stood at the center of that mixture because they were often the primary users and purchasers of household goods. Manufacturers therefore studied them intensely. Market researchers wanted to know what homemakers disliked about appliances, how they shopped, which packages attracted attention, and what features mattered. Focus groups and consumer surveys increasingly treated women's opinions as economically valuable, even while broader society restricted their authority in other areas. The contradiction was striking. A woman might struggle to obtain certain forms of financial independence, Yet be told that her purchasing choices guided the national consumer economy. Her decisions genuinely did matter. Supermarket competition depended on them. Brand loyalty could determine whether products succeeded. A mother who disliked a cereal stopped buying it regardless of advertising. A detergent that damaged clothing could lose customers quickly through word of mouth. Women exchanged product knowledge constantly. Which vacuum cleaner lasted? Which frozen food tasted terrible? Which store had better prices? Which children's shoes survived playground use? Practical consumer expertise became another form of informal knowledge shared through neighborhoods. Shopping trips could therefore be highly efficient. An experienced shopper moved through aisles knowing approximate prices and recognizing when something was genuinely discounted. She compared package sizes mentally. She knew which foods could stretch across several meals. Coupons were clipped and stored. Sales advertisements were checked before leaving home. A few cents saved repeatedly mattered over an entire year. Grocery stores themselves were changing rapidly.